Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for coming out tonight. It's really nice to see a full house. Hope everybody managed to find our place okay. We're kind of hidden right off of Richards there, but really looking forward to Dr. Allen's presentation tonight. But I just wanted to say a few words about the New Mexico Land Conservancy for those of you who aren't really familiar with who we are and what we do. So we're a regional land trust based here in Santa Fe. Our mission is basically to help people conserve the lands they love. And to accomplish that mission, we essentially work with private landowners, community organizations, public agencies, the business sector, nonprofits, to protect, conserve, and restore high conservation value land at community, watershed, and landscape scales. And about 15 years ago, when we were doing our initial strategic planning, we set out a very ambitious goal, which was to protect 1 million acres of high conservation value land directly or in partnership with others. And to date, I'm happy to announce we've actually conserved now over 300,000 acres of land throughout New Mexico. And, thank you. So, as we start the new year and decade, we recognize that we are faced with one of the biggest environmental challenges of our time, global climate change. We've all recently seen the catastrophic fires in Australia, which are resulting from a combination of climate change and a lack of adequate forest and fuel management. And obviously this is nothing new in the western United States. I mean, we've been seeing the impacts of climate change here in New Mexico for years in the form of prolonged drought, which has resulted in forest loss from fire, insects, and disease. So if we're going to do something about it here in New Mexico, I mean, we recognize that as a land trust, we can't just protect land. We're also going to have to think about restoring those lands and restoring the ecological functions and environmental services associated with those lands, and also trying to increase their resiliency and ability to adapt to climate change over the long term. So tonight, we're really pleased to have right here from our own backyard one of the leading experts on forest change resulting from climate change. And sorry, Craig, but I am going to have to just read off a couple of your credentials here. So Dr. Allen is a PhD research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Service's Fort Collins Science Center. He's the station leader of the New Mexico Landscapes Field Station, formerly known as the Jemez Mountains Field Station, based at the Bandelier National Monument, where he's worked as a place-based research ecologist for practically the entire career, right? About 34 years and going strong. He is a core principal investigator of the USGS Western Mountain Initiative, which is an integration of research programs that study global change in mountain ecosystems across the western United States. He also provides technical support in the areas of ecosystem management and restoration to diverse land management agencies in the region. And in 2010, he was named a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences for his outstanding leadership in the synthesis of global forest responses to climate change. He's authored over 85 publications and has been featured in numerous scientific programs, including NOVA, Discovery, and NPR. And the final thing I'll say is apparently Dr. Allen's been a lover of trees and nature since his early childhood in Wisconsin, where he undertook his first ecological restoration project working on his grandfather's 40-acre woodlot. So with that introduction, I turn it over.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm going to talk about this topic today. And really, I'll start right with it. Similar to the introduction, I'm a place-based ecologist. I've spent my whole adult life here. This will be the 40th field season. Started in 1981, scouting my master's thesis work in this part of the world, here particularly in the Jemez. Field station, we have 2 nodes to the field station these days. It's not just the Jemez, but the Jemez has been my home landscape, so you'll see a lot of Jemez stories that I'll go through today. I've basically spent, indeed, my entire adult life doing this because I did both my master's and PhD in the 1980s. working in the Jemez, and eventually it turned into a job. And so I've studied how the landscape's changed as kind of a ecologist slash geographer, and those names don't really mean too much, but using as many different lines as evidence as we can pull together to try to understand whatever phenomenon or change is of interest. I would be remiss without acknowledging up front Kay Bealey, who, patient soul that she is, has worked with me continuously since 1992. So in 93, I hired Kay in 92. She continues to work for Bandelier for the Park Service. But she has indeed been more than my right hand. And all these long-term data sets that we've established in and adjoining Bandelier and other places really are a testament to Kay's staying power as much as mine. And in terms of the quality of what goes on, she's kind of every year training our interns so things are collected. They're as consistently as collected as fieldwork is anywhere over such a long time period. So, but anyway, we have done a lot of worked on a lot of different things with many different colleagues, both in and around the Bandelier landscape in southeast Jemez. And Bandelier's this piece, satellite image of the Jemez land ownership units here. And this chunk in the middle, a device called Dera, which was acquired federally in 2000. And from 2001 to 2003, I helped get a natural resource ecological inventory and monitoring and research program out of the blocks that then in the 93, the Caldera Trust hired Bob Parmenter, who's still working there. And Bob took it and ran. He had formerly run the Sevieta Long-Term Ecological Research Station for the University of New Mexico down near Socorro. There's a lot of stuff in the Jemez. The Jemez is essentially between these units. We've created something like a long-term ecological research site without long-term funding. We've pieced it together as we've gone along, but these are just vegetation plots. There's so many other things that have been worked on, but there's a lot of work that has been done and a lot of ongoing work, and yeah, there's actually not a mountain range with as much work on this scale anywhere in Western North America, a few places in the world. And then on top of that, so these long-term studies going back into, in some cases, the 80s or even older, folks like Terry Fox out of Los Alamos, she set up plots or actually before the 77 La Mesa fire in Bandelier. So her stuff is more than 40 years, those plot networks. And then on top of it, we've had these fires occur. The different colors are different decades of fire, and we'll talk more about that. But so there's been a lot of landscape change. I came in the 80s, and that's what I studied, was landscape change. First out of a geography department, and then as a forest ecologist out of UC Berkeley, the second go-round. And I was reconstructing mostly past change, trying to understand the patterns that we see on the landscape today. To understand today, you not only understand what the patterns and processes are today, documenting those, but then you try to put that in context of best you can using as many lines of evidence of the past. And so I'm going to talk about some of that evidence and what we've done. So that work evolved initially for me primarily in the Jemez, although I poked around elsewhere in the Southwest and adjoining. But this field station now is bimodal, at least here in Santa Fe. Particularly a colleague, I'll note, Ellis Margolis, who he's only been, 5 years now. He's been working with USGS directly with me as an employee, but I actually funded his master's thesis work starting in 1999. And he was working in the Sangre de Cristo. I'll show you that. But he has done more work actually in the Sangre de Cristos as well as other landscapes, but particularly the Sangres have not had much work done in them prior to Ellis. And he's worked them from the bottom to a tree line. So, and we'll talk about that. And he's particularly a dendroecologist as a forest ecologist. A dendroecologist, a tree ring person, using tree rings to do all kinds of things, reconstruct tree flows, climate, and fire. And by the way, this gentleman here is Tom Swetnam, who's been a colleague of mine since 83, 84. He directed the tree ring lab for I don't know how long. He was a major professor for Ellis. He retired to the Jemez, where he grew up. His father had been a district ranger for the Forest Service, including in Jemez Springs when Tom was growing up. But we have, Tom's somebody who's been studying and tromping around the Jemez since, I don't know, late 60s, 70s when he was growing up there. So anyway, it's nice having Tom around as well, who's a globally renowned forest ecologist and scholar. And we work with people west-wide and in some cases globally for different things. Large network, many people we work with. It's part of the idea of the sort of philosophy that of being a place-based researcher. It's not actually, it's not in style, if it ever was, but certainly not today. But I've been co-located with land managers here in northern New Mexico since the 80s, since I was a grad student. That's actually how it turned into a job. That slide is just these are fire history, tree ring, fire scar samples in the Jemez, and we'll talk at length about parts of these networks. But this has been building for decades, and Ellis is taking it, bringing it to a broader spatial level, and we're going to be some really fascinating products coming out of it soon. But I'm going to start with another tree ring study just for longer climate context, to just talk a little bit about the history of climate in this part of the world using tree rings. And wood, we can reconstruct actually at El Mel Pais, west of Albuquerque. There are 4 different tree species that we have more than 2,000 years of record reconstructing climate. It's still actually the best single site location for a tree ring reconstruction in this region. In the Jemez, we're back to the 700s AD, so about 1,300 years, going back using old wood like that. And working with a colleague who was postdocing at Los Alamos at the time, Park Williams, Park looked at all these tree ring records across the southwest region, and he found a temperature signal that had previously been missed. That we all know that when it's wetter, particularly wetter winter springs, trees grow better. And in the subsequent growing season. And when it's multi-year dry, they can be squeezed for a long time. And Park found out that actually that signal he found, yes, of course, as well, but he found a temperature signal that when it's warmer during the growing season, they grow more poorly. And it was a super strong signal because he looked at all the available tree growth data at the time, half dozen years ago, hundreds of thousands of measured tree rings, and the analysis area he whittled it down to is this area in yellow, so basically Arizona, New Mexico, and basically found that half the strength of this predictor that he put together was the temperature. And when it's warmer, trees grow more poorly in the growing season. And I won't talk about it more than that, except that this is a global phenomenon, and it's related to the fact that when the air is warmer, the air essentially can hold more water. And so when the air is over a continental dry area, the air becomes drier and it's pulling. It's pulling from the soil, it's pulling from the plants. When the air is over a wet place like the ocean, because it can hold more water, it does. And that's part of why warming, global warming, is both making places wetter and drier. It's making precip events more severe because there's just more water in the atmosphere to come out in storms. But when you're over dry interior continental areas like the southwest US, during dry periods, that air is just warmer and it's pulling as much as it can, but it's hard on the plants because the soils get drier and the air gets drier and the trees grow more poorly because of that. It's kind of the simplest way to look at it. Anyway, reconstructing from across that whole region, and I'll just emphasize that his results are based on looking all those data together at the whole regional scale. So people are starting to look at like individual mountain ranges, like up here in the Chuscas, to see whether the regional scale patterns still hold. It looks like they do, stronger than some of us might have thought, that because there's gradients across this, 2-state plus region. But anyway, this is at that regional scale. This is back to AD 1000. through 2007, which was where there was enough data to run that analysis at the time. And the individual gray are individual years. So these are calendar years, and this is tree growth being graphed. Or think of it as forest drought stress index, he describes it, but basically it's good growing years above the 0 line and bad below. And the red that you see prominently, and that's what you should look at, don't even try to look at the gray, is a 10-year smoothing put through it. So you can see, because between years there's a lot of noise. I mean, there's a lot of noise at all temporal scales. But so, and you can see it's been wet and dry and wet and dry and wet and dry as far back, and we can do this for regionally 2,000 years. Not with all those dots, but for places like El País, and you see this pattern. So, so it's normal in the Southwest. This level of variability, it's completely normal. And there are some of these very deep so-called mega droughts. Here, this is the late 1200s that pushed the ancestral Puebloan people out of the Four Corners. There's the late 1500s, 1580s into the 90s. That was thought to be the worst mega drought in the last 1,000 years regionally. There's the 1950s drought, which we have actually a lot of historical information on because it's most recent. And then there's this wet period of good growth, and then starting basically right at the end of the 1990s, but called 2000s, we've been calling it the 2000s drought, we entered in another drought there through 2007. This, usually when I give a talk, I talk more about this, and this line would come back up. I'm not going to say more about it, except that when you get down to this level, we have evidence back to the late 1500s drought. Certainly in the 1950s, I and others, tree-killing droughts. So when you push down to this level of drought, probably tree death from drought stress is a natural phenomenon in anywhere in the world. But it's only in these really extreme periods. But I do want to highlight one year. So you see this little green circle there? That's the year 2002. For those of you who've lived here long enough, you may remember 2002, but 2002 was objectively, empirically, the tree growth tells us the worst year for tree growth in the last 1,000 plus years. Although this analysis was not done for the time period 2011, 12, 13, could have been a competing window, and we'll see as that emerges, because that was a really brutal window. But we don't think it's because 2002 was drier than this period here. The late 50, you see there were no good years there in the late 1500s or the late 1200s. Good years. There were no even average years. It was unrelenting, literally for decadal scale. But 2002, we were still relatively early in the drought period. You know, from 2000 to really 03 or 04 was pretty tough, but 02 really stands out because it was warm. And we think the tree growth was so poor. It's not because it was drier from a precip standpoint from a lot of these other bad years, but it was that combination of extreme drought and extreme warmth. And as the world's been getting warmer, again, I expect some of the more recent drought years are going to start looking like this as we look at it. But anyway, 02 was a difficult year regionally. And we saw that expressed on the landscape, on the ground, in a lot of different ways, everything from stream flows to plant stress, mortality, and big fire activity. And it's temperature related, and that Park showed that very clearly in that paper, that this temperature driver of forest not just forest growth, but also these disturbance processes. These are all temperature related disturbance processes. Fire, drought stress, direct physiological drought stress, which can be so extreme it can kill plants directly, and then amplification by insects, actually diseases as well, but things like bark beetles that get a lot of press when they happen, and they have their own dynamics that are partly related to temperature. But I'm going to talk about these a little bit first, and then get to fire. So this is what, on the road going up to Los Alamos, this is the little Sankoe outlying area of Bandelier in fall of 2002. And it just turned, that rusty red, those are pinon trees dying, and that didn't emerge as a signal until the middle of summer. So basically July you started to see this. I first saw this.
Pine bark beetle.
Not pine bark beetle, it was pinon Ips. It's a pinon-specific bark beetle. So there's a lot of different bark beetles. Some of them are more specialized than others. A pine bark beetle isn't even really a common name. Mountain pine beetle is actually one that's more generalized, but you'll see it described that way in news.
80% of our pinon.
Yes, it was that bark beetle, that pinon ips, really amplified the drought stress. But this was that year, right? Remember that growth year, that 2002 year, that everything was gasping out there, plant-wise, vegetation-wise on these landscapes. Anyway, that is the same view. All right, this little dot is a tree. That's the same, that red dot is the same individual tree. I retook those from the same spot after the needles dropped 18 months later. The stuff that's green out there are junipers, one-seed juniper. So this went on to varying degrees over, I don't know, 1 million hectares, more than 2 million acres in the Four Corners region. This is the extreme end of it in terms of the severity. I mean, it literally killed almost all of the mature pinon trees in the Bandelier area. Santa Fe, it was patchier, and it was actually a year lagged. It didn't really start showing up here till 03 so much, 03, 04, a little bit patchier. Pushed up into the Four Corners then, but it hit the east flank of the Jemez hard and early. And on the ground, it was a big deal. This is kind of an overnight transformation in, the dominant plant or co-dominant over large areas. And I spent a lot of time, these woodlands were an area, these pinyon juniper woodlands were an area of a lot of management interest in Bandelier in particular, because that's where most of the archaeological sites were, and there's a lot of soil erosion. So I spent a lot of time in these woodlands documenting runoff and erosion processes, the responses of these woodlands to these die-off of X changes in the understory. Like you get this weedy annual forbs came up in the litter mats underneath. That was like one of the first responses of the system. And the effects of fire in some places where we've had fire intersecting with these changes. But it wasn't just, people lived down in the woodland zone, so the pinon mortality, you're living in a place and your trees died, so it's getting people's attention. But it was all up and down the elevational gradients. And it wasn't just, it was junipers and pinon and ponderosa pine and Douglas fir and white fir and Engelmann spruce and corkbark fir up high, and 70% of the grass cover of the blue grama, the dominant grass cover in Bandelier. We had these vegetation transects we had set up in 91, 3 kilometers, 3 million centimeters individually measured. Jim McGrath, Toby, who you mentioned, he helped us set those up. Okay, in summer of 91. And so we went and remeasured these things. And anyway, bark beetles were not taking out the blue grama, right? I mean, so things that were getting the press. It's the drought stress underlying this that was, so anyway, it was a big deal on these landscapes up and down the gradient, and it was more potent for the range of any one tree species. Usually, like Douglas fir, it started to die first at the lower ends of its distribution. And then a couple years later, it was popping up in the mid and upper parts. And there are different bark beetles. There's a Douglas fir beetle. There's a half dozen different species that hit ponderosa pine here locally of bark beetles as mortality agents. But the beetles are finishing off trees that are in trouble. This is looking at Western North America just for the first decade of the 2000s, 2001 to 2010. The different colors are coded by bark beetles. This is looking through the lens of entomologists, bark beetles, entomologists who are saying, well, there's Douglas fir beetle is this turquoise color here. In that time period, it's actually been a ton of it down here. This blue is the pinon ips. Okay, so this is that Four Corners outbreak into the Great Basin. Anyway, it has been, and is continued, actually, astounding. This thing is the largest insect outbreak documented on the planet to date. That's mountain pine beetle mostly in lodgepole pine, but it hits other species. But anyway, big impact going on out west. But what's underlying that is regional drought in the west going on. And it's continues, moved around. California had its big pulse from 2012 to 2016 was the drought. The lag of mortality has continued, but I mean, you've probably read a lot of this stuff, right? As one of the outcomes of all the big fires there in recent years has been they're trying to implicate or not how much fuels have played into it in terms of dying trees. I don't actually think that did very much to it. Live trees burn quite well, actually. They don't need to be dead. It changes the way things burn. The fuels change, live needles, dead needles, things on the ground, things aerially, but it's not because there were dead trees in the canopy that these big fires are
What burns hotter?
live vegetation would burn hotter if it's dry enough to combust. And it also propagates actually more explosively because it's still got all the terpenoid compounds, the things you smell in it, that actually are degassing on the front end of the thing, and it's just kind of exploding. These standard placing fires are burning needles. Once those needles, those brown needles, fall off the tree, these forests are actually less susceptible to crown fire. Surface fire, they're more susceptible. But in terms of the high severity crown fires, the catastrophic fires that people that we're more concerned about, they're actually more susceptible when these things have needles on and even when they're green. So, and it's not just Western North America, it's globally. And this is because this happened here locally, and there were a number of colleagues that I was working with, including at Los Alamos. Not a lot of ecologists there, but there have been a couple of tree physiologists. First Dave Brashears, well actually first Fairleigh Barnes, then Dave Brashears and Nate McDowell. And anyway, I started working on this stuff globally and then started giving some presentations about these disturbance processes, and turns out this is going on globally. And with many colleagues around the planet, we have been putting together the story, and we're assembling databases now we actually lack a good global monitoring system for tree health at a global scale. Anyway, it's another story. But so anyway, we've scaled that thing up, but it happened, we were able to document it pretty well here because it happened profoundly. I'm going to shift over now to fire. We'll come back to this notion of drought and heat-induced tree mortality as we start looking at multiple disturbances toward the end of the talk. But very briefly, so here we are, this is the Colorado state line with New Mexico. Here's the Jemez, here's the Sangres, south end of the Front Range, Santa Fe's down here. And these are working with Scott Anderson and his folks at Northern Arizona University. He's a paleoecologist, means he works on charcoal and pollen and sediments from lake sediments and bogs primarily. And these are mostly bogs, so a couple little ponds here and some lakes when you get up into Colorado. These are bogs down here, but there are two in the Jemez that one has a 9,000 year record, this one Alamo Bog in the west side of the Vice Caldera, and this one just north of the caldera on Forest Service, Chihuahueños, goes back 15,000 years. This is from Chihuahueños. The core record goes down more than 4 meters. These are radiocarbon dates, so it's older at the bottom, so this is 13,800 radiocarbon dated to the present up here. These are radiocarbon dates. This is something called a lead-210 date that gives us more precision in the recent period. But the point I want to make here is that this is how much charcoal through time. And so this goes back into the last ice age. And there's not too much charcoal and not too much fire activity going on in this bog. Actually, I'm going to just go back so you can see this bog. It sits here, and it's actually just above the headwaters of Chihuahueños Creek, which is deeply in size. It drops right off right behind this. And anyway, but in the early Holocene, sometime a little bit after 10,000 before present, probably around 9,000 at this site, all of a sudden we're getting thousands of particles of charcoal. If you have a lake record and you go, if you're looking at an alpine or subalpine lake, 20, 30 particles per cc, per cubic centimeter of sediment would be a spike. That would reflect like a fire event, probably because it's just it's charcoal that's being lofted in aerially. We're talking thousands, more than 10,000 in some of these CCs here, okay? And Alamo Bog looks the same, actually even more so in some ways profoundly. And it's throughout, and even these places where it doesn't look like there's much, there's still hundreds of particles per CC going on here, except at the top. Those are actually zeros. So the only point I want to make with this is that trying to get the deepest time slice that we can at it, and we did look at tree ring records around these bogs, but we don't have time to talk about all of that at these sites. But they kind of confirm the same thing, that the fires stopped. We get about 400 years of tree ring record at these sites. Lots of fire going on those sites, and then it stops in the late 1800s. Okay, point here is that's something different went on in the last century than was going on for thousands of years. Okay, that's all I want to say about that. In terms of fire, fire is not just one thing. There's this continuum, this gradient of fire behavior, fire effects, and that's associated with these gradients in individual landscapes and geographic landscapes across space at whatever scale you want to choose. Across the Southwest, it's not the same actually, even though Flagstaff and Los Alamos sit at similar elevations, at similar settings on the landscape. The climates and vegetation and the substrates are different enough there that the fire regimes are different. Anyway, up and down these elevation gradients, you get different things. Point is that here, in terms of, we often split fire into these two big categories of high severity, stand replacing crown fires, where it's running through the canopy, blowing and going, and it's consuming fine fuels. It's consuming needles and twigs like the diameter of your fingers. The heavier of live trees. If something's dead, it might consume the dead woody trees, but anything that's live is still wet enough. The fire blows and goes through it, through the fine fuels, versus surface fires that are also burning a lot of fine fuels, but also consuming typically the heavies, the logs and things. Anyway, in our part of the world in the Southwest, high severity fires is a characteristic feature of basically the spruce fir forests at the highest elevations, and the zone of wetter mixed conifer forests that starts to turn into mixed severity regimes where it's some patchy crown fire. But the bulk of the forest and woodland zones were surface fire. That's true in individual mountain ranges and true regionally. And the way to reconstruct these is a little bit different between the two of them. And Ellis, this colleague of mine who I mentioned previously, has spent his career doing that, reconstructing both kinds of these. So he actually did both his master's and PhD reconstructing stand replacing fires, because there had been a lot less work done on those. So starting in '99 through the early first decade of the 2000s, first he worked in the Southern Rockies up into Colorado, these sites. And then this was his master's work, his PhD, he worked down in Arizona and New Mexico, down in mostly the desert basin and ranges where there are little sky islands and little pockets. But anyway, he put together these histories by dating aspen stands and then fire-scarred conifers or tree-killed conifers in and around adjoining those big aspen stands. So he basically sampled some of the biggest aspen stands he could find in the region and worked on those methods. And that's still the big work. And there's other lines of evidence. We look at repeat photos where we can get it. This is Santa Fe Baldy, which actually reflected a stand replacing fire that was 1879 and 80. It's right on the ring boundary. It's a little bit messy. It was probably spring of 80, but it could have been after trees stopped growing in 1879. Been a little slow coming back. Surface fire, though, is where we've done a lot more work, and it affects a lot more of the landscapes. And so this is a tree ring network from the Jemez. So satellite image of the Jemez. This whole landscape is about 1 million acres of the Jemez. More than 1,600 trees dated so far, more than 11,000 fire scars, and actually there's more than that, but we kind of subsampled this super intensive zone here. And with fire scar dates going back 900 years. To 1125 is the earliest one, but where we have good sample depth, you'll see is from about 1600 on. But the way I should have brought one of these. I forget, I usually do. But pieces of wood. But you date the scar. There's these lesions, and we can date not just the individual rings, but even for about 70% of the scars, we can estimate a season by the relative position of where the scar intersects within the annual growth ring. And anyway, this network is for a single mountain range. There might be a landscape in Sweden that has this intensity, but there's nothing else like this on the planet, actually, at this point. The different colors represent different time periods and efforts of, like, the green ones are ones I drove. This was a master's thesis looking at forest and grassland ecotones in the Weiss caldera. That manuscript is close to being out. She didn't finish it. Her major professor. It's taken him most of a decade. I had an email from him today about it. A couple other different kinds. We were looking at oak patches, big oak stands here, and the fire histories in and adjoining oak patches. And a couple parts of the Jemez are these colors. And anyway, different things. This one's associated with a particular study with ancestral Puebloan peoples. And the red stuff is Ellis has filled in all the holes spatially in the last couple of years in a kind of a gridded network, and to be able to do some spatial reconstructions. These dating has just been completed, and he's cleaning it up because he's meticulous about the details of the dating. And I'm going to show you, these results are not published yet because this stuff is just coming online now. But there's, call it 90 sites in the Jemez, all of this stuff. And each one of these horizontal lines represents one of those 90 sites, where a site represents between 10 and 25 trees. And this is filtered, I believe, where 10% of the trees at the site had to, there's a tick mark. So this is calendar years back to 1100 to out here to 2000. Each horizontal line is the timeline of the trees present at that site. And where there's a tick mark means there was a fire where at least 10% of the trees at that site recorded. I don't think this is a 25% filter. I forgot about that. And so anyway, these are, these represent the dots across this landscape. We aggregated into clusters to make the 90 sites, and the red ones, he sampled them more specifically that way. That's the year 1900 through, just as a vertical line, right? And the point I want to make here, so you can see the sample depth. There's one site that goes back with a scar to 1125, but actually that's probably even 1150 because there was probably needed 2 trees. But whatever, before 1500, there's not many sites with data. But by 1600, almost every site has data. So a lot of our statistics or, representations of the fire regimes are based on where we have enough sample depth to be able to tell those stories. But as far back as we go, it's still going on back there. Although certainly some sites more than others. But anyway, there's a lot of and so you see them line up, like this year, and we'll talk about this, 1740, it's hard to see, there's so many in the Jemez. The Jemez is such a fire-rich landscape historically. Anyway, there was a lot of fire frequency, and then you notice what's going on in the 20th century. Where'd all the fire go? And actually, usually when you look at the sites, it's breaking off in the 1880s and 1890s. We'll talk about why that is in a minute, but I think most of you in this room probably already know that. So here's the sites with Ellis's most recent infilling in red, these dots. And what Ellis has started to do, the colors here, by the way, represent the season of the fire. So don't even look at the color. That's another whole set of stories. All right. But that's how he's displayed it. And these are just sort of rough figures that he's playing with right now. But everywhere you see these lit, these are fire-scarred trees in the year 1748, the calendar year 1748. So, we hear these things like, the Cerro Grande fire in 2000, 42,000 acres. That was the biggest fire in New Mexico history. Not. Okay. Las Conchas, 11 years later, 156,000 acres. Biggest fire in New Mexico history. Not. There's Las Conchas footprint. That perimeter. And you can see that's 156,000 acres. This was significantly bigger. We are In 1748, every mountain range in the southwest, that where we have data, we don't have as many samples, but they're all burning. And indeed, most of Western North America, we think in the last 300-400 years, 1748 was the biggest footprint fire year in terms of how many acres burned, because you see this kind of pattern. So anyway, fires used to be way bigger in these landscapes. There were at least 5 fires a century back to 1600. It looks like that are going to be bigger than Las Conchas. Something on that order. I don't know, Ellis hasn't done the full analysis on this yet. But I'll just show you one decade. So here's 1842. So you can see in 1842, again, compared to the modern Las Conchas footprint, there was a lot of fire activity, something bigger, a couple 100,000 acres. That's 1842. There's 5 years later, 1847, and oh my gosh, it burned again, a footprint bigger than Las Conchas. There's 1851. Another, 4 years later? So 3 fires in a decade that are all significantly bigger than the Las Conchas footprint. But these fires, these are surface fire records that we're recording. Individual trees can record, in the Jemez we have trees recording 30 plus fires. I think 32 is the maximum we've got from a tree in the Jemez. It's trees not being killed by these fires, right? It's burning because it's burning on the ground, and the trees that are recording, most trees aren't recording fire because they're protected by their bark once they get big enough to survive. But once they get a scar the first time, they're subject to being scarred again and again. They got a little bit of resin oozing along the edge of the healing part of the wound, and they burn. Even just a little creeping fire seems to send fire up the whole scar, because you see it scarring all the way. The scar face could be as tall as me, and I've seen we see it when we look at, like, in fires, we see it hits these things, and it just sends a little line of fire up the seam of the scar. Anyway, big, extensive surface fires, very frequent in the Jemez. What about the sangres? So here we're looking at the sangres. So far, Ellis is building these networks out now in the sangres. At this point, we're at 700 plus trees, fire dates into the 1200s. We're going to zoom in to this area in and around the Santa Fe part of the world. Santa Fe sits right in there. This is zooming in to that field of view. In this case, the individual dots, again, represent these kind of 10 to 20 tree clusters. Older work that Ellis did in the early 2000s, early mid 2000s, and then more recent work done the last 6-7 years. This is, for that part of the world, does it say here? Yeah, 467 trees in this piece of that landscape, so pretty densely sampled. This is the trees back here into the 1300s. There's 1900 again for reference, so you can see the basic story is still the same in terms of the surface fire. Fire frequencies, haven't done all the calculations yet, but it's going to be a little less frequent for a similar landscape position, pretty sure, than it would have been in the Jemez. A number of things are different on the Sangre de Cristo side in terms of the terrain, the geology, the steepness of the elevational gradients that the forest zones are on. The landscape is not as well connected if you think of it from the ability of fire to propagate and spread. It's not quite as easy in the Sangre de Cristo side. So fires probably didn't spread quite as easily, and so they're not as frequent, but still pretty frequent, and again, still stopping. Actually, often earlier, there's a lot of places in the Sangre de Cristo side where it looks like human influence may have affected fire frequency earlier. And what was first, just a couple of examples of the extent of fire in those places. So there's 1685. It was a big year. But again, this is the surface fire record, but Ellis, this is the Santa Fe River watershed. When you look at this field of view, in which case high elevation, it's maybe a little counterintuitive. High elevation is light colored in this. So he dated that using these basically age structure methods, as well as a few scars of trees that were killed by it. So the uppermost part of that watershed actually burned hot a little more than 300 years ago. It's due, actually. But it was, anyway, pretty big fire along the front of the mountains. There's 1748, that monster fire year regionally. And it was pretty big here too. In 1842, and at that point it's already starting to peter out in this part of the world, like in the Santa Fe watershed. That's the last really widespread surface fire. I mean, there's stuff going on into the 1860s, but so why did it fall apart? Why did these kind of fires stop spreading across the landscape? And it's not just in these local mountains, but it's across actually most of the West in high frequency fire zones and systems, and we think it's tied. It's a little more complicated in northern New Mexico because Europeans came with livestock, but we think it's these things, the John Muir's hooved locusts that they ate the grassy fuels that the surface fires were spreading in. And so you got inadvertent fire suppression, and actually when you read the historical records, people who were out in these landscapes recommended livestock grazing as a way to suppress fire. They recognized it did this. You could see it because it exposed a lot of bare soil. It was just the fire couldn't propagate as easily. And it was tied to when railroads got to the part of the world and markets and all of that. So there was this period through the Depression where livestock grazing was little, not, or poorly regulated, managed, on public lands in particular, but just in a general sense. And that late 1800s, you had inadvertent fire suppression. That combined then, in 1910, there was a policy decision made in this country. Prior to that, there was debate about whether, fire, should we suppress it or not? We have got pretty nice forests in the West with fire. A lot of blame of Indians burning these landscapes. There was a lot of, they didn't even recognize in the 1890s that lightning was a really important ignition source in the West. They blamed it on people. Miners were responsible for some, hunters. It was used by everybody to clearing roads because it was like one of the best tools we had. But shepherds got beat up a lot, and there's some debate about how much they did. But in any case, lightning wasn't even recognized. There's a National Academy of Sciences report from 1893, and and as another accidental cause, in the same sentence where they talk about friction from branches rubbing each other can cause fire, that same sentence they say, and lightning sometimes can cause fire in the West. Okay, railroads, when the railroads arrived, there was a lot of fire associated with railroad corridors. Anyway, livestock effectively suppressed that, the surface fire part of these systems, and the response was these forests that were relatively open with herbaceous understories, and that's where the biodiversity was, turned into these things. This is photos from the 1980s when I was working on my dissertation in the late 80s. We sampled fire scars from right here, one of our little clusters. 1899 was the end of the story there. And we had these massive changes in fuel. So there's this very important land use history component which directly led to big changes in the structure of the vegetation. And vegetation is also fuel in a fire context. So it became more connected horizontally, it became more connected vertically with these things called ladder fuels, which let surface fire get into the canopies, these fine fuels that are the needles and small branches, twigs, and climb into the canopy. And then at that point, they start to create their own convection, their own fire weather, once something gets up and running in the canopy. And it's a big difference when fire is on the ground versus in the canopy. And that happened at the scale of individual sites, of a stand like the scale of this building, but it also happened across whole landscapes. This is a photo actually taken with you. This was on one of those Project Lighthouse flights we went up that day. And this is looking north along the east rim of the caldera. So that's the Valle Grande, that's Cerro del Medio, that's Cerro Grande, Pajarito Mountain, Cañada Bonito, there's Chicoma and Polvadera Peak in the far background. This is before all the big fires. So this would have been 1991, yeah, something I would have said, yeah, right around there, 90 maybe even. I did my master's work in the early 80s on these high elevation grasslands. That's how I can know these things so well, just by looking at them. This, in the 1930s, there's 1935 air photos all across this region. In 1930s, this is all open grassland except there's a little aspen stand here and an aspen stand here and a few scattered trees through this. And the soils underneath these grasslands, I was studying them because they were kind of a curious phenomenon. They're growing in the middle of a zone that you would expect to be forested, but they weren't. And it turns out they weren't for a long time because the soils under these things would look good in Iowa, under tallgrass prairie, but they're up here at 10,000 feet on 40% slopes, which reflects that they were grassland for a long time. They had these really rich prairie soils, grassland soils, but they were filling in rapidly with trees in the 20th century as part of this result of livestock overgrazing, damaging grasslands, and then triggering tree expansion. So anyway, at a landscape scale, these fuels became connected horizontally. And actually, I think that's a prescribed fire going on there. Anyway, we see once we got to the fuels changed markedly in the 20th century, our effort in fire suppression kept ramping up, trying to keep a lid on it, and was successful until in the West, we started to get hotter and drier conditions emerging in the latter part of the 20th century, and then all over in the West, we started to pop fires that aren't suppressible any longer. And these are all local fires, pictures I took just by being in the landscape. And I know what time that was, and it means I'm talking too long again. So I'm going to go much quicker here. Just show you, this is what fires looked like in the 20th century in the Jemez. We have records back to 1909. That's the first 81 years of fire records in the Jemez. Different colors are different decades. These bigger patches are the 1970s. So there are a couple fires over toward Jemez Spring. That's the La Mesa fire, which was a big deal in the Southwest, a 15,000 acre fire in 77. Nobody'd seen a fire that big since the 1950s drought. And there were only a handful of those that got to like 10,000 plus in the 50s. Well, we popped one there. And so this is when actually fire ecology studies began in this part of the world, was with Lauren Potter and Terry Fox working on this thing. Anyway, that's the first 81 years. There's the next decade of the 90s. There's the Dome fire. This is actually a prescribed burn. That's a wildfire. That's the Oso complex. There's the 2000s, dominated by the Cerro Grande, the biggest fire in New Mexico history. There is the first 4 years of the 2010s, dominated by Las Conchas and Thompson Ridge fire, centered on Redondo Peak. Anyway, you see the scale of fire has been increasing, and we're trying harder than ever to keep these things suppressed, and we're not able to do it. And then, just remind you, again, we know in the past fires were bigger, so I would just tell you as an ecologist, thinking about how fire operated in these landscapes, it's not how extensive, it's not how many acres burned, but how they burned, that ecologically and, well, societally and hydrologically and geomorphologically, that's where fire has been different. So it's what is the size and the spatial distribution of high severity fire, tree killing fire, if you will. And that, from fire severity mapping from 96 to the present, is the big fires in the Jemez. There's littler things that we don't have in the system, but these are the biggest fires. It's pretty much blown out the forests on the east side of the mountain range and some parts of central here. We'll see if this shows up well enough. I tried this before and it didn't, but I think it might today. So this is, I think, 1995 imagery. It's just out of Google Earth. This is Los Alamos, the caldera, Los Alamos town site here. Bandelier, you can see the La Mesa fire has already happened, but this is pre-Dome fire. There's La Mesa, I throw the fires, Dome, 96, Oso Complex, 98. Cerro Grande. The dark colors, the brown, are tree killing fire, the high severity patches. Lakes in 02, Las Conchas 11, Thompson Ridge 13. So what does it look like when you put it on the ground? So there, this dark stuff is forest on the rim, and that, it goes away because it has mostly gone away on the east flank. We're going to zoom in a little closer into the Los Alamos area. So again, here's the town site and the lab area. This is the La Mesa fire footprint. And again. And actually, this biggest patch of forest that was left is, in fact, this may not even have, yeah, it does. It must be shadowed in a particular way because the trees have all been killed through there. But anyway, this biggest patch of conifer left on the east side is an area that actually we'd gotten fire into a couple times in the headwaters of Frijoles Creek. Anyway, Las Conchas fire, I could tell you good stories about that, but we don't have time. But you all know it happened. Will be almost 9, it'll be 9 years this June. This is all from the first day run that fire got up and ran, and in the first 14 hours burned the footprint of the Cerro Grande fire. But the vast majority of that was high severity tree killing fire. These are all photos from that first day run footprint. All the way down into woodlands that some extraordinary fire behavior that people still argue about what went on, that fire modelers can't even model fire moving through this. That slow coming back. What you see on the bottom, which raises a whole lot of questions, so I guess we need to get to that part, the fate and the part of the talk, is there's a lot of uncertainty about where forests, both locally, regionally, and more broadly, are going, because the world is changing. And some of those changes have to do with our management or land use practices through time, interacting with things like climate, natural climate variability, and now these directional climate trends. What we see in the footprints of these big fires is the lowest, driest elevations have been least resilient in the sense of biggest loss of what was there before when it burns high severity, and very slow in coming back. Although part of that might be we've been still in a relatively dry window. These last wet winters have been still not even really quite the long-term mean. It just feels so much better. But places at mid-elevation, this is in Ponderosa Pine Forest out in the Dome area. This was like a week after the fire burned through there. These are logs that were killed in the 96 Dome fire that then were consumed 15 years later by this fire. But there was a lot of shrubs in here, and those shrubs resprouted quickly. Okay, and these areas are now, again, dominated even more so by shrubs, but much more resilient than that next portion down, that dry woodland zone, but in a lot of places we are seeing forest converting to non-forest. Combinations of shrublands, grasslands of varying sorts. There's issues with exotic plants in there, partly from our seeding efforts. This idea to put Band-Aids on top of these things to protect the watersheds has a lot of people haven't paid much attention to the ecological consequences of that, of introducing exotic plant materials. And then there's just an extraordinary amount of watershed consequences to these high severity fires. Hill slope rilling, debris flows, reaming out of the stuff in the bottoms, transport of material. This is in the north side of the Valle Grande, coming off of Cerro del Medio. It's not even that big of a drainage that pulled out of there. It has done extraordinary things to water quality around here, and that has gotten the attention of society. That's partly why there's a lot more attention being paid to doing something with forests because of their importance as watersheds. They're the water towers of the West have been the mountains, and the forests have been an important regulating component of those watersheds. In Bandelier and the whole east flank, actually Jemez everywhere affected by the Las Conchas footprint, from wrapping west of Coche de Pueblo all the way around the east flank and up to Santa Clara. We've had behavior like that in these canyon bottoms. This is a site that's been monitored at Bandelier. We're studying this now, the effects of this in Bandelier, because we were starting to be 3-4 years ago a bit puzzled, if not concerned, by the slow recovery of riparian vegetation, which is normally pretty resilient to being severely disturbed. It evolves with things like floods, at some level of flood. Anyway, this is a long-term water quality monitoring site taken the fall before Las Conchas. There's that same site a month post-fire, a couple weeks post-fire. There it is after a couple of floods. There's a whole sequence. 3 years post-fire. Anyway, we're studying the effects of this in these two major watersheds in Bandelier. I'm hoping a year from now, maybe more like a year and a half from now, we'll have results. But working with some colleagues who specialize in looking at riparian systems in terms of the ecology, the hydrology, and the geomorphology, integrating that into the canyon bottom systems. But I can tell you already that we're seeing extirpations of whole plant species. This is sort of a north distribution of this alder species, which is beautiful. This is one of my favorite trees in all of Bandelier. It survived dome fire, but it didn't make it through Las Conchas. Yellow lady slippers were known from one locality in Jemez in Frijoles Canyon. That site doesn't even exist. It was removed, physically removed by the flooding and then buried by sediment transported by the debris flows. But we think there may be a half dozen similar plant species in the Frijoles watershed that aren't, at least not findable anymore. This is not just a Jemez thing going over to the Sangre de Cristo side, just photos of some of the big fires, Vivash fire in 2000, Encebado up Taos Way, and Borrego in 03, Pacheco, which was sort of the forerunner on this side. That was the one many of us thought would get the upper part of the Santa Fe watershed before Las Conchas put its smoke plume over the top of it and abated the fire. As the Las Conchas fire was rocking and rolling, it seemed that it actually moderated the fire behavior of this fire to the east of it, which was under the plume. Meanwhile, they were still selling fireworks there at Buffalo Thunder before that. Jorosa fire. Anyway, this is footprints. Here's Santa Fe. This is where the Pecos River goes in. It's similar kind of a map of the decade where the 2010s, the 2000s and the 2010s, this is where the big action has been. Although there was this bigger fire again in the 70s. Anyway, moving forward, what do we see? The world is warming. This is global land and ocean, which is probably the best way to look at sort of the heat change, the energy change on the planet. And actually, this is through 2018, 2019, they haven't released this yet, but it looks like it's probably going to be number 3. But all the warmest years have been in the last half dozen years, globally. The trend is clear enough. And this is the sort of famous hockey stick image from one of the earlier IPCC reports. But this is a 1,000-year history. This is the northern hemisphere temperature reconstructed from tree rings and corals and ice cores, sort of wiggling around here. And then here's the 20th century rise. Here's 2100, the 2000s we're in right now, and we're on the fast track. These different trajectories depend on how serious we get with dealing with CO2, but we're on the fast track of this. And with this 1 degree or so, it's now like 1.1 degrees C globally, we are already seeing these effects popping up in systems around the world. I just couldn't help, you mentioned it, Australia. This is the month of December, NASA, of fire footprint for that month. And of course, it was really blowing and going the first 2 weeks of January, and it's starting to crank up again. But it's this down here in the southeast. This always burns up here. This is different. This stuff up in the tropical northern part. But what's going on in the forests in the southeast has been truly extraordinary in Australia. And it's not a coincidence. Part of it has been a change in land use practices in terms of, again, Aboriginal peoples used to use fire in a way that didn't let the densities build up in the same way. But 2019 was both the hottest and driest year in the instrumental record in Australia. So this climate has a role on top of these other land use kind of roles. But it was burning literally to the beaches, as probably you were seeing. I mean, people were being trapped, creating these pyrocumulus clouds and vortex behavior that they really have seen only rarely prior to that there, with big effects on humans and wildlife. I mean, they're thinking there's literally will be some number of species that go extinct from these fires because they have a lot of vulnerable species that were in very small populations. And it's the severity of the fires. Again, it's more than the footprint, it's the severity that has fire ecologists concerned in Australia. And I couldn't help but one snarky cartoon, because Tolls is so good, this But the climate coal mine, by the way, how's the canary doing? Which is labeled Australia, and it's on fire there. It's flames. And then the little guy in the corner says, oh, it's done. Yeah, well done. All right. But these tipping point changes are emerging. I could go through examples from Sweden to pick your spot where we're seeing behavior. The Germans, 3 years ago, weren't worried about drought stress on their forests because they've been resilient up to that point. Well, the last 2 summers have changed their mind. Anyway, back to our part of the world, what do we have? Warming increases the frequency, severity, and extent of forest disturbances of multiple kinds. We are seeing surprises, tipping point changes, novel ecosystems. We can't hold on to what our historical forests were, even if we wanted to. At least we can't hold on to them unchanged. We can moderate the rapidity of change, perhaps, but things like new insect outbreaks. This is a little defoliator of a little brown, inconspicuous brown moth called Janet's looper that in the winter chews on Doug fir and spruce trees. And it was never seen in northern New Mexico until the last couple winters. It was recorded once in the state, down on the Lincoln National Forest, down in the Sacramentos. We don't know anything about it, but we're presuming the warmer winters are allowing this thing to move north. But you can see, this is, the ski basin road is coming up through here. You can see this stuff. Anyway, and one of my things that I think about a lot is old growth trees, big old trees and forests, intact historical forests, the forests that nature grew on this planet, and what does warming mean for it? And it turns out it's particularly bad news for reasons I won't go into here, but that's true globally, and it's true locally. These are natural responses to the history of land use change and to climate. And there are some things we can do with it. I mean, just the drought and heat-induced tree mortality is not all a bad thing. These are trees that died in 02 to 04. In Upper Frijoles, this was fire patches from La Mesa, but this is, again, reduced the continuity of the canopy, made them less susceptible to crown fire. And indeed, some of that survived Las Conchas when it came through. There are well-proven management treatments. A lot of it's pretty direct, straightforward, not rocket science, as people say, in terms of mechanically and using fire to change the three-dimensional structures, the amount and the three-dimensional structures of the fuels in ways that affect fire behavior. And as forest managers, caretakers, we can do these kind of things, reduce forest densities and fuel buildups with a variety of treatments. So we need to be strategic about where we break up the spatial continuity at landscape scale so fire can't run 15 miles in a day. It needs to come back down to the ground because the south-facing slopes in the southwest did not have canopies touching themselves prior to 1900. That didn't happen. They were open because they're hotter, drier, and they had high-frequency fire running all the way up, at least in the Jemez, they were running all the way up to the summits, up to 10, 11,000 feet on the south slopes. Was surface fire. If we want to keep big old trees in our landscape, they are going to die through combinations of drought, stress, insects. They are dying. We're seeing it happening now. They are preferentially dying. Big old trees are preferentially susceptible to drought and heat stress. We see that in forests all over the world, including here in the southwest and the west. The one thing that we can do to buy them some more time and to decrease sort of the hard reset that comes from an overnight high severity fire event is to use some of these treatments to reduce the density and the number of competing stems, which we've had order of magnitude increases in these small trees that used to be thinned naturally by the high frequency fires. So anyway, thinking about promoting incremental change is one of the managers this is a disconcerting time for land managers all over the planet. They're having to change their way of thinking, the ways they have been taught, the paradigms about was to use the past as a guide. And people like me reconstructing the past were part of promoting that perspective that yes, we should use the past as as a guide, not a perfect guide, but as a guide to what is at least possible, how the system was work, what it could be. The past is no longer a good guide as it was before, and we are on the verge of moving into unprecedented space, and so there's going to be a lot of surprises. And that's because nature is already responding, and she isn't going to wait for us to make political decisions on this stuff. But there are successes out there, and the Gila, the big Gila Wilderness Forest Service started letting fires burn in the 70s. Yeah, with some caution and imperfectly, but enough to make a difference. The next biggest fire in New Mexico history was the Whitewater Baldy Fire, a year after Las Conchas. And went in with there some folks, and in those Ponderosa Pine systems where fire had burned, there was a lot of resilience. A lot of it looked like this. This is a forest, there's 24 of these collaborative forest landscape restoration projects. There's been one in the Jemez. It's not getting refunded. They just, in the last week or two, found out, apparently. They were looking to extend it. Its time frame had come up. They were pretty slow getting out of the blocks, but there's been a project work trying to introduce some heterogeneity into this forest on this side so it doesn't do this on the west side. Here on the east side, where this east side of the Jemez, where this has happened, one of the things that's gone on is a colleague of mine, Colin Haffey, with some folks at NAU and multiple collaborators, basically this chunk of landscape from Santa Clara in the north, wrapping down through Los Alamos and Bandelier and Coche de Pueblo, have been part of this East Jemez Landscape Futures effort, basically trying to think about what do we want? This landscape got reset. We can't go back to what it was before. What should we be doing? So there's a lot of efforts about what to do in post-fire landscapes. And this is an emerging theme across the West because we're seeing so much of it. And we're seeing a lot of this where it's not going back, or it looks like it's not going back to where it was before. Another effort, this is 2 weeks ago. You may have seen press release, New Mexico State, along with Highlands, and at Mora, there's a nursery run by Owen here. Owen Bernie. Anyway, basically a bunch of funding to be dealing with, trying to think about what do we do after the fires. Owen's answer to that is plant trees. Genetically improved and better grown, but we need to think about what we're doing with that. And so anyway, there's efforts like this going on. Kind of iconically has been work done in the Santa Fe River watershed, 40% or so of the municipal water supply for the city. And there's been 20 years of work there, multi-parties, and basically it's resulted in the lower half of that watershed being treated, the non-wilderness, not all of it, but not even all of the non-wilderness portion, but in an effort to try to make the probability of high severity fire low in that area, and all the things that would go with it. The Las Conchas fire triggered Laura McCarthy, who was working for TNC, who is now the state forester. The city of Albuquerque and Santa Fe both had to shut their water intakes for varying lengths of time on the Rio Grande because of the water quality issues, just the amount of sediment. It really viscerally got the powers that be, literally the economic and political powers, saying, oh, this could be kind of an existential threat societally and economically to us. And so people became more interested in those circles to the fate of upland montane forests. And Laura started basically this notion slowly, but building, I don't know, there's like 85 players in this thing now. The Rio Grande Water Fund, which is basically looking at the upper Rio Grande watershed above Albuquerque. They're a little poking around a little bit in the Sandias and Manzanos too on the east side. But anyway, scaling this thing up, doing many analyses. And then locally, one piece in that, the Rio Grande Water Fund, we've been doing fire histories in Taos because people in those watersheds are concerned, ranging from the Pueblo to the county to the Taos Ski Valley. That's why there's been so much work in fire history done here as well, is trying to have some basis for figuring out what did these forests used to look like, how much have they changed, how vulnerable are they moving forward. So this Greater Santa Fe Fireshed Coalition with many partners, goals. Anyway, you can go to their website and read this stuff. But it's going on. If we want some semblance of forest that isn't being reset to something else on really broad spatial scales, there will be refugia that'll last through the first set of events. But this is why there's this pressure to treat on significant areas that haven't happened for a long time. So in closing, I would just say, as an ecologist studying this near and far, that the world is rapidly moving beyond that historical range of variability that we have used to set our basis for everything from how big the culverts should be in our roads to how we manage our landscapes. And we're increasingly going to need to anticipate, adapt to, and begin managing for a somewhat uncertain, and increasingly, as you go farther out, if we let it get unhinged, future range of variability. There's an immense amount of societal learning to do moving forward involving everybody, not just scientists, land managers, the public, all sorts of folks. But despite the risks and uncertainties, we know enough about some things. And there's a lot of work been done on fire and fuels management. Unfortunately, there's no magic wands. The treatments have consequences and trade-offs on the landscape, but those are consequences and trade-offs we need to assess and discuss and make decisions about. But these are all different possible outcomes on landscapes. It's not preordained. We have some say in it. So last slide, I would just say there's hopeful opportunities and options, but we do need to act with urgency. We need to work collaboratively. We need to continue to learn. And nonetheless, we should expect to continue to have surprises. And so with that, I close. So.
Thank you.
In areas with pinyon trees, when a pinyon tree falls over, that's a great habitat for maybe 1 to 3 little pinyons to pop up. In these areas of massive pinyon die-off, are we still getting the babies popping up, or is the drought and other factors so much interfering with it that we're not?
More the second, but there, where we've studied it fairly intensively in the pinyon juniper woodlands in Bandler, we've done a lot. And including studying what happened, we had some plots that we just coincidentally and fortuitously put in 2001, the year before things started to die, where every tree was tagged, including seedlings, and we were dating it. We were actually trying to get the signal from the 1950s drought. We started then, as these trees started to die, we started following them, like every couple months at first, and then we've been studying every year since we go back and see if there's any change. About half every mature tree died.
Right.
And there were, these are, it's 2.5 acres total, 2 half-hectare plots. But about half the seedlings survived. But we have not seen any new seedlings come up. One year there were 3 that came up in a cluster, or probably like a Clark's Nutcracker, Cash, but they didn't make it a year. And they weren't there the next year. But those seedlings that were there pre-established before that dieback event, about half of the things that are, from like chest high down survived. And those have been releasing, and so if climate allows, if it doesn't get too severe, those will become codominants again, but it takes a couple decades before they become reproductive. So places like here in a lot of the Santa Fe area, it was not such a total wipeout of the mature population, so there are still seed sources in some of these better years, but in the Bandler area, there's almost no seed source. That might be part of it where we are.
Greg, as urban people and not necessarily land managers, what can we do to be effective toward this future this blank future that...
Well, I mean, this is, there's multiple levels to that, right? I mean, obviously there's a societal, we need to change the way we do energy. We need to change that curve. At 1 degree C, I mean, to tell you the truth, increasingly, the bad news that you hear about, oh, scientists worry about the ice caps and sea level rise and forest fires burning, that's the tip of the iceberg of how, in the communities I interact with, how we experience it. I mean, we're starting to, and scientists can be kind of in their head disconnected from it to some extent. They're starting to be terrified it's because we know there are these nonlinear tipping points, thresholds, embedded in both physical processes, like, at 0 degrees C, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, water converts from water to solid in there, right? And all of a sudden everything changes biophysically. But those things are true in biological systems, ecological systems as well. And we are pushing, climate is a fundamental component of these biophysical processes, and we're pushing them to new ranges of variability everywhere. And so the historical processes, the physical processes and the historical ecological processes are necessarily entrained in that climate, and they hit these tipping points at all different spatial scales, and then of course there's interactions with that. And so we're starting to see these things pop up, and it's happening quicker than a lot of people expected. I've been a little bit less surprised because I've been seeing it happen for 20 years. And have been writing about it, and it's, to some extent, that's been my career, is documenting the emergence of these kind of changes on the landscape and trying to put them into some sort of historical context based on our relatively good ability to reconstruct the last couple hundred years of vegetation structure. Anyway, we need to change how we do energy, or, in the end, everything's going to Mother Nature's going to do what she must do, okay? We're not at that point yet. We still have choices. We can moderate. We can take some of the sting out. And again, one of the best things we can do is try to foster incremental changes in terms of these transitions, because it's mostly going to be done by natural processes anyway. I mean, we're not planting all of that, no. So, Carl, I'll get you in a minute, but let me ask Denise here.
Could you say, so I've been frustrated with the Forest Service and kind of or maybe with the plan in general, that there are things that are not so much in the realm of the forestry people and others who've been looking at this. And one example would be banning grazing in forest lands. Mm-hmm. Another would be banning open fires. And then, on the city and county government, we're still building all over in the zones where it's going to be, the firefighters going to end up being hurt. But I feel like the plan, I may be addressing this to any Forest Service people in the room, but any Laura McCarthy and everybody else, that the plan is heavy on emphasis on pure mechanical thinning and burning that we can do in the forest itself, and stays way away from kind of the social responses that are maybe painful for some people to ask for, but need to be done.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. I mean, that those elements are all important. I mean, it's certainly from a human standpoint, a societal standpoint, that those things, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Two questions. I've seen models from Lano and all over the Southwest, and particularly northern New Mexico, and they're projecting there might not be any conifer trees in northern Mexico in 50 years. What do you think about that? Also, there's one new thing that's changing, that these fires are so large and burning so hot that it scorches the land, and the fires cannot reestablish themselves, like Whitewater Ball and the other fires that came from Arizona.
But you said the fires cannot reestablish themselves?
The forest
cannot reestablish.
Sorry.
And then, of course, we just saw it again in Davos, and nothing's changing and happening, so.
So I'll address the first point second. What was your second, what do you want me to say about the second thing?
Is that true? The fires are burning so much hotter that it scorches the land.
Not everywhere.
The forest can't reestablish.
Not everywhere, but it's on a spatial scale that it's getting people's attention.
It's still, in these big fires, it's still on the order of a third of most large fires that burn at high severity. And another third that burn about right, or maybe more. We'll say that. And then another third that actually doesn't burn hot enough to make enough of a treatment. But you know, there's about a third of these areas burned are actually burning in a way that we would prescribe if we could. So no, it's not, and it's not uniform. I mean, Las Conchas was, I want to think that Las Conchas is kind of the tail of the distribution currently, okay, in terms of that. There were just a lot of things lined up to make that be possible, including in part where that fire started, which was in sort of the most densely fuel untreated part of the mountain range. It was an area we knew and recognized was that had, and it got up and ran, and then what we were surprised is that it went into the footprint of some of these other fires, particularly the dome fire on that first day, and it behaved extraordinarily. And a lot of it wasn't witnessed because it happened in the smoke and in the dark and in the night. But there was some really extraordinary fire behavior happened that night that drove it through that 15-year-old fire footprint and killed most of the vast majority of what had survived, at least in the Ponderosa Pine zone of that fire, and then went down into the woodland in some ways. So anyway, I'm not, no, I mean, and it's self-limiting at some level because these fuels, the Cerro Grande fire did constrain the Las Conchas fire. I mean, they evacuated Los Alamos for a week. I was still living there then. Well, I wasn't actually, but we still had a house there, and they could let people back because they could manage the fire where it had gotten into those fuels. So anyway, it's not. It's not wholesale in a way like that, but it's, I mean, you look at the east flank of the Jemez, the forest is pretty much gone. There's little pockets of things and it's not regenerating. But planting can work sometimes. The post-Cerro Grande fire was surprisingly effective. You can see, and that was like kids and volunteers doing that. The stuff that the Forest Service has been doing in the dome has been mostly failing.
And your opinion on Lannell's model?
Oh, well, Lannell's Mountain, I was part of that work. And so the key paper came out 3 years ago. Well, there's multiple papers, but one of them that got a lot of press was not the first one, looked at a half dozen different kinds of models. And they all kind of converged saying by mid-century, it doesn't look good for conifers in the Southwest. Conifers in the Southwest. And if we stay on this trajectory, I think that's true. It may not even take till 2050s, because we can see during extreme years, even like 02 in the 2000-2004 window, which was, I mean, it's going to be a lot warmer than that soon, was enough to really hit these systems hard. 11, 12, 13, if we hadn't got that monster rain in September of 13, I think we would have seen another whole pulse of mortality all up and down the elevational gradient. It was starting to emerge. But things that survived in good enough condition to get, I mean, that kind of revived things because it saturated these landscapes, right? It rained for a week. It was a 500-year precip event in the Jemez. We got more precip in 1 week at the Bandler Fire Tower than any month in the instrumental record. You know, it was one of these old cut-off hurricanes. It's the thing that caused all the flooding along the Front Range up through Boulder. They're still putting roads together back there. So, yeah, which is another example of this kind of extreme event. Anyway, what do I think about it? I think that's the trajectory we're on. Okay, there will be parts of the landscape that are better buffered, places in riparian zones, places where kind of, you see this in fires as well. The little pockets of refugia often are topographically defined, not completely, but you can see it statistically when you look at, you're more likely to survive in those places. It'll have a longer duration, but no, I mean, you just can't change, even if precip doesn't change, which it looks like it's gonna, you can't change temperature as much as we're on a trajectory to do it now without having everything have to reassemble. So I do think that's true in a general sense. But Stanley.
So I was happy to hear you say that, you know, a third or so, I would think that'd be more than that, of fire is actually beneficial, that there's low severity.
Oh, I would say more of it has been, I was saying a third of it is probably like right in the
Yeah.
zone where people would have targeted it.
But I just disagree on this type conversion question.
Mhm.
I mean, so the aspen that's coming back in the Jemez, in those high severity areas, the oak and the locust, these are pioneering species, as you know. I mean, that is a forest. That is recovery. That's the first stage of recovery. You know, with every end, it's also the beginning. This is the beginning we're seeing. And so that's one, that's maybe a philosophical point.
No, I don't think so. Let me just respond, because I think it's a good point. And I didn't, you know, I talked too long, as it was, Sam, right? Again, but what I want to say, and at some point I'll illustrate it better in these talks, is that this gradient of response, the elevation gradient, you know, I noted that right at the low end, we're going every year and rereading the transects down on Sanchez Mesa down at the bottom, and that's like, it's still 5% ground cover down there. And it's not even the stuff that was there before a lot of it. It's dominated literally by cheatgrass and tumbleweed are the two dominant plants across this whole mesa.
Yeah.
All right.
That's
At the mid, I went to the mid zone and I showed, the recovery of the shrubs. Okay, Robinia and the oak there. And I would agree entirely as you go higher, both the severity effects tended to be a bit more patchy, not entirely, but there's more of these resprouting woody plants.
Yeah.
Whether the conifers come back in, I think that's another whole question. Yes, historically you might have said that was true, that this was sort of just stage one of a successional process.
The other thing is the efficacy of large-scale, regional, west-wide restoration efforts. So, as you know, there's about a 10 or 15-year window when you go in and do a treatment, you know, cutting trees and burning, in which the fuels are reduced. And then after that, the shrubs and the seedlings and grasses come back. So there's, you know, looking at it, as you well know, from a large perspective, we can't go into these areas to the scale that you may think is needed. I mean...
Yeah, no, we won't do it with mechanical means. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so the Forest Service is still suppressing 98% of all fires.
Probably so, although I will tell you, especially in this region, they're turning the corner selectively. Even the 1% that they're making some decisions on to manage, as managed wildfires, they are strategically taking advantage of those opportunities increasingly. I mean,
Not in northern New Mexico, in the Gila, yes, perhaps.
even here, Dennis Carroll is trying hard for those opportunities, but there's a lot of changes that are taken to doing, but they're doing it. They've done it on several cases, including in the Jemez. Not so much over in the Sangres yet that I've seen, but in the Jemez they have done a number of them where they basically back off. Right? They're managed wildfires. They're still treating them as a wildfire. They're still suppressing them, but they're suppressing them. They're picking where they're gonna let it burn up to a certain point. And because they're recognizing the thing you just said, Sam, that fire is really the only restoring fire in a scale, you know, but we all know what the big constraint's going to be on that. And actually a question she asked before, that's one we could think about, is smoke. The ultimate thing that's going to probably is going to be a real conflict. People think of that when these whole mountain ranges were burning, how much smoke there must have been in these landscapes. When we look at this, we've had people, historians, people like Dubuis looking. The Spaniards mentioned smoke. No, people it wasn't even worth talking about because it was just part of the system. You know, our sense of what was normal was reset in the 20th century, leading smart people like scientists at Los Alamos National Laboratory to put facilities in really dumb places, down in floodplains, I mean, like with really hazardous materials. They built a $13 million dam after the Cerro Grande fire in Pajarito Canyon. The Corps built that thing in like 6 weeks, working round the clock to protect White Rock. Well, they were also protecting a subterranean bunker facility that was just downstream of where that lab was. And the sediments, of course, that were involved in this. So, but it reset our notions of what forests should look like, of what the distributions of as the forest structure changes, the wildlife changes to match, to, adapt to what it looks like at this moment, because that's the habitat they're in. How hydrology works, everything from the base flow, the annual yield of the Santa Fe watershed went down by about 15% in the 20th century, probably because of the thickening of the forest. We see this in other systems elsewhere. The behavior post-fire changes. Anyway, all these things, that part of it we did, in terms of management and the feedbacks associated with that, and our knowledge of that has been emerging for decades, but it's been slow to translate societally. The climate change thing is now another whole axis, and it's becoming an overriding driver depending on what it is, but it's synergistic and interacts with some of these other changes, and we don't have great crystal balls, but we have some knowledge, and we don't have wands. And so, and that's kind of the conversation we've had a little bit. The question is whether are imperfect management actions better than none? And there are trade-offs, and I will grant that for sure. So.
One more. You told me you were Gabby and that I should keep.
Yeah. People should leave if they need to leave.
One more question. That's
Yeah.
Okay, I just thought I'd mention it.
I'll answer your question if she doesn't hook me.
I was really encouraged that you said you were open to new paradigms. I'm wondering if one of them might be the Suzanne Simard and the overstory idea that underneath the tree are these mycelium, mycorrhizal cabling, and communicative networks also above ground. And we now know that, as John Donne said, no man is an island, no tree can stand by itself. So my worry is, as is Denise, we threaten to excessively thin without the awareness of the new forestry paradigm. Will you speak to this new paradigm?
Sure. I actually know Suzanne, and I know that work, and I spoke to her at some length about it actually at a meeting in the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. Has a once every 4-year meeting, and it was in Brazil in early October, and I was there. She was one of the keynote speakers. Her work is great. She's great. I asked her, we had lunch and spent probably an hour and a half talking about this stuff. There's a lot. She didn't have answers for most of my questions about it, but they're fascinating to both of us. That work is true, but it's not, and you might be interested to know, her big emphasis these days is actually working with industry and the land managers in British Columbia, trying to answer these very same questions, and trying to apply aspects of our ignorance underground is profound, and so much of what goes underground is important. And the work on the connection of the mycorrhizal fungi and what trees and how they communicate to each other. So nothing is an island on the planet. I mean, everything is interactive. It's all connected. That's principle of the universe 101, and it's certainly ecology 101. And so it's another really great example of it underground, but it's not. You can stick a tree seedling in the ground and it's not inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi and it can still grow. I mean, I'm not saying you should do that. I'm not saying we should ignore it, but it isn't the kind of overwhelming constraint that some people make it out to be. And these forests have actually changed a lot. The densities, many of those trees, the densities are 10-fold greater than they were a century ago or 120 years ago in most of the forest types in this part of the world. And removing some of the trees in these systems is not, doesn't cause the system to just collapse and go belly up. It has effects, because there are interactions that are going on in the ground. But yes, I'm not only open to those paradigms, I voraciously follow that work, because what goes on the ground is so important. So, yeah, please go.